And now we are moving to Dr. Isaac Sasson. He is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Tel Aviv University, and he is doing research about the epidemiology of longevity. Now he's going to talk about the uncertainty of the length of time. Is it so? Please.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for being here today and the organizers especially for inviting me to present my research. Today I will talk briefly about the social shaping of uncertainty in length of life. And I think by now most of us have become accustomed to talking about the social rather than the biological determinants of longevity. So for example, we know that socioeconomic status, lifestyle, social ties, and many other social factors determine or shape the length of life. But today I'd like to develop the argument the social factors also determine our subjective perception of how long we will live. And this is really important for a variety of outcomes and behavioral changes. So this is the only figure I'll show today that's not from my own research, sadly. It's a remarkable figure. And this one shows us the rise in life expectancy at birth, 500 years ago to almost the present, in England and Wales, and from 1750 also in Sweden. And this would be very similar if we looked at other countries. Of course, the periods would be a little different. And basically, life expectancy at birth before the Industrial Revolution was about 35 years in both of those countries, which was actually higher than all other countries in the world at the time. And since then, especially since 1750, with the Industrial Revolution, we've seen life expectancy at birth more than double, almost triple in some countries, and now it's actually surpassing 80 years in most rich countries, and will hopefully soon in other countries too. Now, demographer Tim Dyson tells us that the historical rise in longevity that many of us are familiar with has also set in motion a socio-psychological revolution in our attitude toward death. So over the course of merely 200 years, we now expect, all of us, so most of us expect to grow old, which was really unparalleled in human history. So for example, if I take France, which I haven't shown you the data, but if I take France, for example, post-Napoleonic France in the early 19th century, over 30% of newborns would not survive the age of 10, and only 3% of the population or newborns would live to celebrate their 85th birthday. If we look at France today and Israel and many other countries, over half of newborns can expect to live beyond 85. So this is a remarkable change and really unprecedented in human history. So we not only live longer, but we expect to live longer. And this revolution really affected our demographic and economic behavior. So for example, now it affected how many children we have. We have fewer children because we expect more of them to live, to survive to old age. It changed life cycle consumption and spending. I think all of us, at least Israelis in the room, are obligated to save money for retirement, and I think many people do this in other countries, whether voluntarily or not. And it also created the multi-generational family, or at least increased its scale, because I think, if for example, a recent study showed that in 1900 in the United States, life expectancy was 47, and then the average American could expect to live 5 years concurrently with any of their grandchildren. By the end of the 20th century, this number increased to 35 years. So we expect to know our grandparents, and our grandparents expect to know their grandchildren, and perhaps even other generations. So this is relatively new in human history. But the prospects of growing old are not, or having confidence about the future of growing old, are not equally shared by all people. So for example, this is from a study I published a few years ago. We look at life expectancy at age 25 by socioeconomic status, or by number of years of completed schooling. And we see that people who have more education tend to live longer. So at age 25, this is additional years that you might expect to live. And we see that those who have graduated from college can expect to live longer than those who have not, and especially compared to the high school non-completers. But the remarkable thing about this trend is that these gaps existed almost 30 years ago, but they widened dramatically or substantially since then. So, example, if we look at men, the difference in 1990 between the college-educated and the high school dropouts or non-completers, the difference was about 5 years, and for women it was about 2.5 years. If we look at the most recent data from 2015, the gap increased to 13 years among the high school among men, and almost 9 years for women. So I think these gradients, we see this is for the United States, but we see them similar gradients in other rich countries to a different extent, and also in Israel. But I think it is worthwhile to look beyond group differences in mean length of life, to look at the distribution of ages at death as well. So this is basically what I did here in this study. And I looked at the distribution of ages at death. Again, this is, if I want to look at educational groups, I have to wait until they complete their at least college level education. So I'd look at age 25 and beyond. And then we can see what is the proportion of deaths that occur in each age. Now, there are two curves in this one. The solid one reflects the college-educated men in this case. And the dashed line represents the high school non-completers, those who did not graduate from high school. And we see that there are differences between the distributions, but this is in 1990. This is in 2010. So we see that the college-educated are pushing forward, and whereas the high school dropouts have actually regressed. Now, if we looked at life expectancy, that would be the mean of this distribution, but we can also see that there are differences in dispersion, which is what I want to look at next. So if we look at the differences between these two figures, the area between the curves, this is the proportion of premature and perhaps preventable deaths. So I would like to advance the argument that if we measure this dispersion of lifespan variability, the dispersion in age at death distributions, so this measure of lifespan variation actually has two functions. One, it is a measure of inequality. From a macro or population perspective, it measures the heterogeneity in underlying population health. And generally, increasing lifespan variation signals uneven age patterns of mortality decline, and sometimes also mortality increase in younger ages, which is what we've been seeing for the last several years in the United States. So I'm positive most of you have heard about the midlife crisis that the United States is going through, and this would trigger an increase in variation or in the dispersion of this distribution. But it is also, I think, is a measure of individual uncertainty in how long we might live. Because if I take you back to these distributions, we see a very narrow distribution for the college educated. So planning ahead our life, we can be pretty sure that we will reach old age. And indeed, the modal age at death, the most common age at death for American women who ever attended college, even if they did not graduate, is now 87. So basically, if you take a college-educated woman, American woman, you ask her, you make her bet, how long do you think you will live? Her best bet would be 87. But if we look at the least educated men, we see that their distribution is nearly flat, so the risk is much more widespread, and they have a harder time planning their future. So if I take this is a simple measure that we all know. There are many other measures that I could show you, but for now, for simplicity, I want to focus on the standard deviation of this distribution of ages of death at age 25, after 25. We see that a mirror image of the figure I showed you earlier. So now we see that there's higher variation among the least educated and low variation among the highly educated. Now the thing is that for even the high school educated and some college education, those with some college education, variation has increased over time. So basically we're seeing this distribution widening. Now I can break it down. I think in the interest of time, maybe I won't show all these slides, but I think, so for example, we can break it down by age. This figure is a bit complicated, but it shows that the contribution of specific age groups or change in mortality or age-specific mortality rates to the change in life expectancy that we've seen earlier. So basically, if you take each of these columns and sum over the bars, you will get the difference that we've seen earlier. But here it's broken down by age. And we see that, for example, for high school educated women, if we go right of this sort of middle line, these are improvements or gains in longevity, and bars to the left of the line are negative contributions, so this is declining life expectancy. So we actually see that we've seen continued improvements for old women, or old high school educated women, but increasing mortality for the middle-aged and younger women. We see a similar picture for men. This is for non-Hispanic whites. For non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics, things are slightly better, but it's an open question whether they will follow this pattern or not. There is some information on this in the paper, but in the interest of time, I will skip that. We can also break it down by cause of death, but I think maybe we will, I won't get into the detail here, but this is smoking-related diseases, cardiovascular cancers, and so on and so forth. Now, you may think that this is an American phenomenon because, American exceptionalism, right? It's a very, it's a country that suffers from substantial socioeconomic inequality. So you may think this may be just peculiar or unique to the American experience. But it turns out that it's not, because me and some colleagues have replicated the study in Finland. And we see that, for example, here among Finnish women, we see that we see similar patterns. So we don't see declines in life expectancy for the low educated, but we do see this dispersion occurring or divergence in lifespan variation between socioeconomic groups, whether we measure it through education, with income, or occupational class, and so on. And this, our hypothesis now is this is occurring in many countries, in the rich countries or economically developed countries in the world. I'm hoping to replicate this in Israel, but this is still pending. Now the question is, these are the objective trends. What about the subjective? So it's very hard to, I think a long-standing theoretical question in sociology, demography, and several other disciplines in the social sciences is how do people become aware of their demographic reality? So it's not enough for life expectancy to increase for us to think differently about our lives. We need to perceive that it's increasing and which would really influence our behavior. So this is a really difficult question. We have some idea we get from Richard Wilkinson in his book from 1996, Unhealthy Societies. I think it's a very nice quote. He tells us, perhaps the easiest way of seeing intuitively what the socioeconomic differences in death rates mean is to imagine two people, each with a similar sized group of friends and relations, but living in separate rich and poor areas. For every death that occurs among the circle of friends of the person in the rich area, the person in the poor area will know of 2, 3, or even 4 times as many deaths among his or her circle of friends. These are not imagined. We do observe mortality rates that are 2, 3, or 4 times higher among low socioeconomic groups compared to high socioeconomic groups. So we actually know the number of deaths that we know in our group of friends or family ties relates to our socioeconomic status, our ethnic origin, or ethnic group, and so on and so forth. So I think we're now making first steps in sort of trying to tie the subjective measure of perception of mortality that we face every day. So if I take someone who's 50 and ask them how many people have died in your circle of friends, but we can also ask them, as other surveys have already done, the Health and Retirement Study in the United States, the SHARE in Europe and in Israel, we basically ask people, what are the chances that you will live to be, and depending on their age, they push it a few years and they say 75, 80, 90, and so on up to 120. It turns out that the answers to these questions, so people expect how long they expect to live, really correlates with education, income, and wealth, all of these factors that we have shown that objectively determine our length of life. We also know that people tend to change their perception following the loss of family members. So if I lose a spouse or a parent, I tend to update, probably lower my expectations because I think maybe I'm not going to live as long as I thought. We know that it predicts psychological distress, and these measures are less predictive of actual mortality among low SES people. Now, previously, people have interpreted this finding as saying, well, low-educated people, they have a hard time with probabilities. They don't know better. But we actually see now, with the previous results that I've shown you, that they objectively suffer from more widespread risk in terms of their longevity or length of life. So this is truly an ontological issue and not an epistemological issue. And we also know that perceptions actually affect decisions and retirement decisions, claiming social security benefits and so on. Studies have shown if people expect to die or not live very long, they say, why should I wait? I should claim my benefits now because who knows what's going to happen in the future. So I think this would be very important for moving forward. So in conclusion, there's mounting evidence that socioeconomic inequality in length of life is increasing in rich countries. This is pretty much universal. But my study, research, and as well as others has shown that group differences in average length of life are also accompanied by differences in lifespan variability. So it's not just a measure of an average, but it's also about the dispersion. And there's some economic theory to suggest, we know maybe perhaps also normative, this is something that we need to look at, that some people would trade off. They would say, I would prefer to live maybe slightly less, but have less risk, to know. So basically, you can take two societies that life expectancy is 80 in both of them, but one has a very narrow distribution of ages at death. So most people reach 80. And you can take a very unequal society where the average is 80, but some people die at 60 and some people live to 100. So if you ask people, which society would you rather live, they would obviously say the first society. But it turns out they would also be willing to trade off a couple of years or a few years of life expectancy in return to having lower uncertainty. And lifespan variation indicates both heterogeneity in population health. This is a macro perspective that is very old, I think, this interpretation. But I think we need to think more about what it means for individuals who are expected to excess mortality, potentially, if they live in a certain area. Now, this sound maybe imaginary, but just last year there was a study published in PNAS that shows that, for example, for African American children in the United States, they're 3 times more likely to become orphaned by the age of 10. So this is quite significant if you think about what their perception of how long they might live if their parents died young. And of course, this risk is differentially distributed between socioeconomic groups, ethnic groups, and other social groups. So thank you for attending, and happy to take questions.
Okay, questions?
Yes.
Please. Mm-hmm. years higher than men, yes.
For men,
yes.
And you see, in Russia,
yes. Yes, yeah.
So,
I think it's a good suggestion, yeah. Thank you. I just completed a couple of weeks ago a report or forecasting life expectancy in Israel for the Social Security Administration, or the National Institute of Insurance in Israel, Bituach Leumi. And basically, this is a very difficult question. But if we look at just trends, there are a lot of theories. What happens if if you read Yuval Noah Harari, you get all sorts of ideas. But many of these are, for at least now, they seem. We don't know what their viability is, but if we look at trends, not just in Israel, but in other countries, Israel is quite high in terms of life expectancy, but if you look at Switzerland and Japan, we see that actually improvements have slowed down in the last decade. But it is a question. If there's a new technological revolution, we might see an upsurge again in life expectancy. This is a really important question, yeah.
Okay.